In the pre-dawn darkness of June 5th, 1944, along the southern coast of England, thousands of young American soldiers prepared for what would become the largest amphibious invasion in human history. But this story isn't about those men who would storm the beaches of Normandy at first light. This is the story of a different kind of warrior, a group of men who would jump from aircraft into occupied France hours before the beach landings began. Men who looked more like ancient tribal warriors than American soldiers. Men who deliberately rejected every standard of military discipline, except the one that mattered most, the ability to fight. They called themselves the Filthy 13. The landscape of military service in 1943 was defined by rigid conformity. Young men from farms and cities across America found themselves transformed by the machinery of war. Heads shaved to identical lengths, uniforms pressed with military precision, boots polished until they reflected light like mirrors, every movement choreographed, every action regulated, every soldier molded into an interchangeable part of a vast military organization. This was the United States Army. This was discipline. This was order. But in a training camp in Georgia, and later in the green fields of England, one group of paratroopers was writing a different story entirely. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment was part of the newly formed 101st Airborne Division. The Screaming Eagles, as they would become known. Within the regimental headquarters company of the 506th, there existed a specialized unit, the Demolition Section. Their mission was straightforward but incredibly dangerous. Jump behind enemy lines, locate critical infrastructure, bridges, communication centers, supply depots, destroy them. These weren't ordinary paratroopers. They were experts in explosives, men who could calculate blast radii in their heads, who could assemble detonators in complete darkness, who could set charges while under enemy fire. And leading this demolition section was a man who would become a legend, Jake McNeese. Born in the Dust Bowl of Oklahoma during the Great Depression, Jake was part Choctaw Indian. He grew up hard, learned to fight early, learned that rules were made by people who had power, and that those rules didn't always make sense. When Jake joined the paratroopers in 1942, he wasn't looking for glory or advancement through the ranks. He was looking to fight the enemy. Everything else was just noise. Jake stood about 5 feet 9 inches tall, lean and muscular from years of hard labor, dark eyes that seemed to see right through pretense, a face that rarely smiled but somehow inspired absolute loyalty. He had this quality that you can't teach in any military academy, natural leadership, the ability to make men follow him into hell itself if necessary. And he began gathering around him soldiers who thought the way he did, men who cared about one thing above all others, being ready for combat. Charles Plauto from Pennsylvania, a former boxer with fists like hammers and a temperament to match. Jack Agnew from Oregon, Jake's closest friend, tough as boot leather and twice as mean when he needed to be. Robert Cohn, quiet and methodical, the kind of man who could assemble explosives with the patience of a watchmaker. Joe Oleskiewicz, whose Polish name most people couldn't pronounce, so they just called him Ole. John Agnew, Jack's brother, who followed his sibling into the paratroopers and into this notorious unit. One by one, Jake assembled his team. Some were assigned to him. Others requested transfer to the demolition section because they'd heard about this sergeant who didn't care about the Mickey Mouse regulations. By early 1944, the core group had formed. Roughly 13 men, give or take a few, depending on transfers and training accidents. And they had developed a reputation, not for excellence in drill and ceremony, not for having the cleanest barracks or the shiniest boots. No, they had developed a reputation for being the filthiest soldiers in the entire 101st Airborne Division. Possibly the filthiest soldiers in the entire United States Army. The barracks that housed the demolition section of the 506th looked like a disaster area, gear strewn across every available surface, mud tracked in and never cleaned, windows that hadn't been washed in months, the smell of unwashed bodies and dirty laundry hanging heavy in the air. While other units maintained their living quarters with military precision, the Filthy 13's barracks were condemned by every officer who inspected them, written up again and again, orders given to clean them up, orders that were ignored as soon as the inspecting officer left. Personal hygiene among the Filthy 13 was equally appalling by military standards. They would go days, sometimes weeks, without bathing. Their uniforms were wrinkled, stained, sometimes torn. They rarely shaved. Their hair, when they bothered to cut it at all, was hacked at irregularly. They looked like a band of outlaws who had somehow acquired American military uniforms. And this was completely intentional. Jake McNeese had a philosophy that he drilled into every man in his unit. Time spent shining boots was time not spent training with explosives. Time spent pressing uniforms was time not spent at the rifle range. Time spent mopping floors was time not spent studying enemy fortifications and planning their destruction. Every minute of every day should be focused on one question. Will this make me better at killing Germans and staying alive while doing it? If the answer was no, then it wasn't worth doing. This philosophy drove the officers in the 506th absolutely insane. Colonel Robert Sink commanded the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, a West Point graduate, a man who believed in military discipline and standards. And in his regiment, there was this demolition section that seemed to operate by their own rules entirely. Sink had Jake McNeese in his office constantly, chewing him out, threatening courts-martial, busting him down in rank. Jake would stand there at attention, or his version of attention anyway, and take the dressing down. Yes, sir. No, sir. It won't happen again, sir. And then he'd walk out, and he continued doing exactly what he'd been doing before. But here's the thing that saved Jake and his Filthy 13 time and time again. When it came to actual military skills, they were exceptional. At the demolition range, they could calculate blast patterns and set charges faster than any other unit. At the rifle range, they consistently scored expert marksman ratings. In field exercises, they completed their objectives with brutal efficiency. And when it came to parachute jumps, they went out the door without hesitation, every single time. Colonel Sink understood this paradox. He had soldiers who couldn't pass a basic uniform inspection. But those same soldiers were arguably the best combat troops in his regiment. So a pattern developed. The Filthy 13 would get in trouble, drunk and disorderly at a local pub, fighting with British soldiers or with other American units, missing formations, failing inspections. They'd be punished, confined to barracks, extra duty, reduction in rank. And then a training exercise would come up that required demolition experts, or a practice jump that needed experienced paratroopers. And suddenly Jake and his men would be pulled out of whatever punishment detail they were on. Because they were needed. This happened over and over throughout their training in the United States and later in England. The cycle of punishment and redemption. The officers hated them. But the officers also knew they needed them. In the winter and spring of 1944, the 101st Airborne Division was stationed in southern England. The entire division knew that an invasion of France was coming. Everyone could feel it in the air. The constant training exercises, the aerial reconnaissance photographs being studied, the maps of French coastline appearing in briefing rooms. Something big was being planned, and the Filthy 13 prepared in their own way. While other units practiced parade ground drills, Jake's men were in the woods with explosives, learning to work faster, learning to work in complete darkness, learning to set charges while exhausted, cold, wet, under stress. While other units held inspections and formations, the Filthy 13 were practicing parachute landings, jumping again and again, learning to land in trees, in water, on uneven ground, preparing for every possible scenario. Their social life, if you could call it that, was equally intense. The Filthy 13 would descend on local pubs like a force of nature. They drank prodigiously. English bitter and ale flowing by the gallon. They drink British soldiers under the table. They'd drink other American units under the table, and then they'd get into fights, not out of malice necessarily, but because these were young men filled with aggression and testosterone, and they needed an outlet. The fights were legendary, brawls that spilled out into the streets, military police trying to break them up. Sometimes dozens of soldiers involved, British and American, all throwing punches. Jake himself was arrested more times than anyone could count, thrown in the stockade, threatened with dishonorable discharge, but then an officer would need demolition experts for an exercise, and Jake would be released, charges quietly dropped, the cycle continuing. One particular incident stands out in the historical record. In March of 1944, Jake and several members of the Filthy 13 got into a massive brawl with British soldiers in a pub near their base. The fight started over something trivial, a spilled drink, an insult. The actual cause was lost in the chaos, but within minutes 30 or 40 soldiers were throwing punches, tables overturned, glass breaking, the pub owner screaming for them to stop. By the time the military police arrived, the pub was destroyed. Jake and 5 of his men were arrested. The British Army wanted them prosecuted. The American Army was prepared to court-martial them. But then Colonel Sink intervened, not because he liked Jake or approved of his behavior, but because the 506th had a major training exercise coming up, an exercise that required the demolition section. So Jake and his men were released with a stern warning and a promise that next time there would be real consequences. There never were. As spring turned to early summer in 1944, the intensity of training increased. The men of the 101st Airborne knew the invasion was imminent. They could see it in the faces of their officers, in the sealed orders being delivered, in the way entire sections of southern England had been declared off-limits to civilians. In late May, the division was moved to marshalling areas near the airfields from which they would depart, sealed behind barbed wire. No communication with the outside world allowed. This was it. The mission they had trained for was about to begin. The briefing started. Maps were revealed. Normandy. The target was Normandy in northern France. The 101st Airborne would jump inland from Utah Beach. Their objectives were to secure the causeways leading from the beach, to disrupt German communications, to sow chaos behind enemy lines before the amphibious landings began. For the Filthy 13 specifically, their mission was critical. They were to destroy a bridge over the Douve River near the town of Carentan. This bridge could be used by German armored units to bring reinforcements to the beach. If the Filthy 13 could blow it, they would save countless American lives on Utah Beach. The mission was clear. The mission was dangerous. And Jake McNeese and his men prepared for it in their own unique way. On the afternoon of June 5th, as the men of the 506 PIR prepared their equipment and boarded trucks that would take them to the airfield, Jake made a decision. He pulled out a straight razor, and he began shaving his head into a mohawk. The style was inspired by his Choctaw heritage, warriors painting themselves for battle. Jake saw this jump into France as no different from his ancestors going to war generations earlier. So he would mark himself as a warrior. The other men of the Filthy 13 watched him, and one by one they asked Jake to give them the same haircut. Charles Plauto sat down and Jake shaved a mohawk into his hair. Jack Agnew was next, then Robert Cohn. One after another, the Filthy 13 were transformed. Some got full mohawks, a strip of hair running down the center of their heads, everything else shaved clean. Others had Jake shave their heads, completely bald, except for a single tuft of hair. When they were done with the haircuts, they took mud and charcoal, and they painted their faces. War paint, stripes across cheekbones, handprints on foreheads, patterns that had no specific meaning but looked absolutely terrifying. By the time they finished, they didn't look like American soldiers anymore. They looked like something out of a nightmare. Ancient warriors somehow transported to 1944. Word spread quickly through the staging area. Soldiers came to see the filthy 13 in their war paint and mohawks. Some laughed. Some were inspired. Some thought Jake and his men had lost their minds. But everyone remembered them. When the men of the 506 PER boarded their C-47 transport aircraft that evening, the filthy 13 stood out dramatically. While other paratroopers looked relatively uniform in their equipment and appearance, Jake's men looked like they had stepped out of a different era entirely. The aircraft took off as darkness fell. Hundreds of C-47s packed with paratroopers rising into the evening sky over England. The aerial armada that would deliver the American Airborne Divisions to France. Inside the aircraft, the men sat on canvas benches along the fuselage walls, parachutes strapped to their backs, reserve chutes strapped to their fronts, weapons and equipment hanging off them, sometimes over 100 pounds of gear per man, so heavily laden that some men needed help standing up. The flight across the English Channel was tense. The aircraft flew low, trying to stay under German radar. The men sat in darkness, alone with their thoughts. Jake McNeice, his face still painted, his mohawk clearly visible even in the dim light, sat quietly, outwardly calm. Inside, his mind was racing through the mission, the bridge, the charges, the detonators, every detail reviewed again and again. Some men tried to sleep, others prayed, a few joked nervously. Gallows humor to keep the fear at bay. As they approached the Normandy coast, German anti-aircraft fire began. Tracer rounds rising from the ground like strings of deadly pearls. Flak explosions bursting around the aircraft, black smoke puffing in the sky. The sound of shrapnel hitting the thin aluminum skin of the C-47. Some aircraft were hit badly, some caught fire, some went down, spinning toward the ground, paratroopers trapped inside with no chance to jump. The pilots took evasive action, turning and diving, trying to avoid the worst of the fire. But this meant the tight formations broke apart. Aircraft scattered across the sky. The careful planning of drop zones and timing began to fall apart. Inside Jake's aircraft, the men waited for the red light near the door to turn green. Red meant stay seated. Green meant jump. The jump master standing by the door was shouting over the noise of engines and anti-aircraft fire. Stand up, hook up, check equipment. The familiar commands of a parachute jump. But this time, real bullets were flying. This time, men were dying. The green light came on. Go, go, go! The first man went out the door, then the next, then the next. Each paratrooper shuffling forward in their heavy equipment and launching themselves into the darkness. Jake went out into the night sky over Normandy. The prop blast hit him, spinning him slightly. Then the opening shock as his parachute deployed. And suddenly, relative silence. Just the sound of wind and distant explosions. He looked around, trying to orient himself, trying to see where other members of his unit were landing. But it was too dark, too chaotic. He could see parachutes scattered across the sky, but he had no idea who they belonged to. Below him, the dark landscape of Normandy. Fields and hedgerows and small clusters of buildings. Somewhere down there was the bridge he needed to destroy. But first he had to survive the landing. And then he had to find his men. Jake hit the ground hard in a field, the landing driving the air from his lungs. He quickly gathered his parachute, didn't want the white canopy marking his position. Released his harness, checked his weapon, an M1 carbine, checked his explosives, carefully packed in his bag. Everything intact. Now to find the others. He pulled out the cricket clicker that every paratrooper had been issued, a small metal device that made a distinctive clicking sound when you pressed it. 1 click meant I'm here. 2 clicks in response meant I'm American. If you didn't get the 2-click response, you assumed the person was German and you opened fire. Jake moved carefully through the dark field, clicking his cricket. Listening, click, click. off to his left. He moved toward the sound, found a paratrooper from another unit. Neither of them had any idea where they were. The drop had scattered the paratroopers across miles of Norman countryside. Men who were supposed to land together were separated by fields and rivers. Some landed in the ocean and drowned. Some landed in fields that the Germans had deliberately flooded and drowned in just a few feet of water. Two weighted down by equipment to stand. Some landed directly on German positions and were killed before they hit the ground. The entire airborne operation was turning into chaos. But Jake had a mission. Find his men. Find the bridge. Blow the bridge. For the next several hours, through the early morning darkness of June 6th, Jake moved through the Normandy countryside, clicking his cricket, finding American paratroopers one by one. Sometimes it was a member of the Filthy 13. More often it was someone from another unit entirely. Slowly, a group formed around Jake. Not the group he had trained with, but a group nonetheless. Maybe 6 members of his original 13, plus another dozen paratroopers from various units, all of them lost, all of them looking for leadership. Jake provided that leadership. He took command of this ad hoc unit and began moving toward where he believed the bridge should be. The Norman hedgerows made navigation nearly impossible. These weren't the neat hedges you might see in an English garden. These were massive earthen banks, topped with thick vegetation, some of them 8 or 10 feet high. They divided the countryside into a maze of small fields. You couldn't see more than 50 yards in any direction. Perfect defensive terrain. Terrible for attacking forces. As dawn broke on D-Day, Jake and his assembled group were still searching for the bridge. They could hear gunfire in the distance. The invasion had begun. On the beaches, thousands of American soldiers were landing under intense German fire. Inland, scattered groups of paratroopers like Jake's were trying to accomplish their missions. Finally, around mid-morning, they found it. The bridge over the Douve River. It was still standing. And it was lightly defended. Jake had expected more German soldiers, but the confusion of the airborne drops had pulled German forces in many different directions. The guards at the bridge were nervous, undermanned. Jake didn't hesitate. He organized his group for an assault. Some men would provide covering fire, others would rush the bridge. The attack went quickly. A short, brutal firefight. The German guards were overwhelmed. Some were killed, others surrendered, a few ran. Within minutes, Jake's group controlled the bridge. Now came the part that the Filthy 13 had trained for: demolition. Jake and the few members of his original unit who were with him went to work. They placed charges on the bridge supports, carefully calculated amounts of explosive, wired the detonators together, ran the firing wire back to a safe distance. Jake personally checked every charge. This couldn't fail. Too many lives depended on this bridge being destroyed. When everything was ready, Jake looked back at the bridge one more time. Then he triggered the detonator. The explosions were massive. The bridge supports disintegrated. The entire structure collapsed into the river. Mission accomplished. The Germans would not be reinforcing the beach through this route. But for Jake and the Filthy 13, the work was just beginning. Over the next several weeks, as the Battle of Normandy raged, the demolition section was constantly in action. They moved through the hedgerows, fighting alongside regular infantry. They blew up more bridges. They destroyed German supply depots. They laid ambushes along roads. The hedgerow fighting was nightmarish. Every field was a potential death trap. German machine guns covered every approach. Snipers hid in the thick vegetation. Artillery rained down constantly. Casualties were staggering. The 101st Airborne, along with the rest of the Allied forces in Normandy, was grinding through German defenses meter by meter. The Filthy 13 lost men during this period, some killed by sniper fire, some by artillery, some by booby traps. Each loss was felt deeply by the survivors. These weren't just fellow soldiers, they were brothers. But there was no time to grieve properly. The mission continued. By late June, the 101st Airborne had pushed inland from the beaches. They had taken the town of Carentan after vicious street fighting. They had connected with forces landing from the beaches. The invasion was succeeding, though at terrible cost. In July, the division was pulled back to England to rest and refit. They had been in continuous combat for over a month. They had taken heavy casualties. They needed time to recover, to bring in replacement soldiers, to prepare for the next operation. During this rest period, Jake McNeice was promoted again and demoted again. The cycle continued. He still couldn't help himself when it came to regulations. But by now his reputation was such that even official rank didn't matter. The men looked to Jake as their leader regardless of the stripes on his sleeve. The next major operation came in September of 1944. Operation Market Garden, an ambitious plan to drop airborne forces to capture a series of bridges in Holland. Then armored units would race across those bridges, punch through into Germany, and hopefully end the war before Christmas. The 101st Airborne's mission was to capture and hold bridges around the city of Eindhoven in southern Holland. On September 17th, the Filthy 13 jumped into Holland. This jump went more smoothly than Normandy, better weather, less anti-aircraft fire. The drop zones were more accurate, but the fighting on the ground was intense. German forces in Holland were stronger than Allied intelligence had predicted. They fought hard to prevent the capture of the bridges. The Filthy 13 found themselves in urban combat, fighting house to house through Dutch towns, dealing with German snipers in church steeples, setting demolition charges to clear roadblocks. Market Garden, despite some initial successes, ultimately failed. The bridge at Arnhem, the farthest objective, could not be held. British paratroopers there were decimated, the entire operation ground to a halt. The 101st Airborne held their positions around Eindhoven, but could not advance further. After several weeks of combat in Holland, the division was again pulled back to France, again to rest and refit, again to replace casualties and prepare for whatever came next. What came next was hell. In December of 1944, the Germans launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. This became known as the Battle of the Bulge. German forces smashed through American lines, creating a huge bulge in the Allied front. The Germans were driving for the port of Antwerp, trying to split the Allied armies in two. The situation was desperate. The 101st Airborne Division was rushed to the Belgian town of Bastogne, a critical road junction. If the Germans took Bastogne, they could continue their advance. If the Americans held it, the German offensive would stall. The 101st, including the Filthy 13, were loaded onto trucks in the middle of winter, most without proper winter gear. Rushed to Bastogne without knowing exactly what situation they were heading into. They arrived to find the town nearly surrounded by German forces, and what followed was one of the most famous sieges in American military history. The 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne, outnumbered, outgunned, cut off from supplies. The weather was terrible, freezing temperatures and heavy snow and fog so thick that Allied aircraft couldn't fly. No resupply missions, no air support. The men at Bastogne were on their own. The Filthy 13 manned positions on the perimeter of the American defenses, fighting off repeated German attacks. German infantry supported by tanks. Artillery bombardment that went on for hours. The cold was as dangerous as the Germans. Men's feet froze in their boots. Frostbite was rampant. Weapons froze and had to be constantly maintained to keep them working. Food ran low, ammunition ran low. Medical supplies ran critically low. The wounded couldn't be evacuated because there were no aircraft flying. And still the 101st held. On December 22nd, German officers approached American lines under a white flag. They delivered a message demanding the American surrender. General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the 101st at Bastogne, sent back a one-word reply: nuts. The Germans, confused by the American slang, asked for clarification. The American officer explained it meant the same as go to hell. The siege continued. The Filthy 13, like every other unit at Bastogne, refused to even consider surrender. They were cold, hungry, running low on ammunition. But they kept fighting. Jake McNeice kept his men's morale up through sheer force of personality, making jokes in the middle of artillery barrages, scrounging extra rations from somewhere, and sharing them. Leading by example, always at the front, always in the thick of the fighting. Finally, on December 26th, the weather cleared. Allied aircraft were able to drop supplies, food, ammunition, medical supplies. The men at Bastogne could finally resupply. And then Patton's Third Army broke through the German lines surrounding Bastogne. The siege was lifted. The 101st Airborne had held. The German offensive was broken. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for several more weeks, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Germans had failed. The Filthy 13 survived Bastogne, though not without losses. More men wounded, more men killed. The unit that had started as 13 men was now a mix of original members and replacements, but the spirit remained. After Bastogne, the 101 was pulled back yet again, this time to France for an extended rest period. The division had been through 3 major operations, Normandy, Holland, and Bastogne. They had earned a rest. The final months of the war in Europe saw the 101st Airborne operating as regular infantry rather than making combat jumps. They pushed into Germany as part of the general Allied advance. By this point, German resistance was collapsing. Some units still fought fanatically, but many others surrendered quickly or simply melted away. In early May of 1945, the 101st Airborne Division captured Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps. Hitler's personal retreat, the Eagle's Nest, was taken. The war in Europe was over. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. For the Filthy 13, for Jake McNeice, for the survivors of that original unit, the war was finally finished. They had jumped into Normandy on D-Day, fought through the hedgerows of France, jumped into Holland, held the line at Bastogne, pushed into Germany. They had done everything asked of them and more. Of the original 13 men who had formed the core of the unit, only a handful survived the war without being wounded or killed. The price had been high, but they had paid it. Jake McNeice returned to the United States after the war, back to civilian life, back to Oklahoma. He worked various jobs over the years, started a family, lived a relatively quiet life, but he never forgot the Filthy 13, and he made sure the world didn't forget them either. In the decades after the war, Jake gave interviews about his experiences. He attended reunions of the 506 PIR and the 101 Airborne. He became the keeper of the Filthy 13's history. In 1967, a movie called The Dirty Dozen was released, a fictionalized story about military prisoners sent on a suicide mission behind enemy lines. The movie was inspired, at least in part, by the real Filthy 13. Jake McNeice was consulted during the film's production. Though Hollywood changed many details, the spirit of the movie captured something of the Filthy 13 story. A group of misfits and troublemakers who were nonetheless incredibly effective soldiers. The legacy of the Filthy 13 extends beyond that single movie. The image of paratroopers with mohawks and war paint has become iconic. In subsequent conflicts, American paratroopers have occasionally revived this tradition. During the invasion of Panama in 1989, some paratroopers shaved mohawks before jumping. During the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the tradition appeared again. It has become a symbol of the airborne warrior spirit, a connection to those original 13 who shaved their heads on the evening of June 5, 1944. The story of the Filthy 13 raises profound questions about military discipline and effectiveness. How much does personal appearance really matter? How important is traditional military discipline compared to combat skills? The military's answer has generally been that both matter. That discipline in small things translates to discipline in large things. But the Filthy 13 proved that this isn't always true. They showed that you could reject most traditional military standards and still be incredibly effective warriors. The key was focus. Everything they did was focused on combat readiness. If something didn't contribute to that goal, they ignored it. This approach can't work for every unit, can't work for an entire army, but for a small specialized unit with the right leader, it worked brilliantly. Modern special operations forces have learned from this example. Units like the Navy, SEALs, Army Special Forces, Delta Force. They focus intensely on mission accomplishment. They're given more flexibility on personal appearance than regular units. They grow beards on deployment. They wear civilian clothes mixed with military gear. They operate with fewer regulations. In many ways, they are the spiritual descendants of the Filthy 13. But even these elite units maintain more discipline than Jake McNeese's men did. They're professionals who take their training seriously. The military learned from the Filthy 13, but also recognized the limits of their approach. Jake McNeese lived until 2003. He spent his final years as a recognized World War II veteran, speaking at events, meeting with historians, making sure the story of the Filthy 13 was preserved. He died knowing that his unit's legacy was secure, that they would be remembered not just as troublemakers, but as warriors. Today, the Filthy 13 remain one of the most famous units of World War II. Their story has been told in books, documentaries, and films. The image of those paratroopers boarding C-47s with mohawks and war paint remains instantly recognizable. They represent something important in military history. The idea that sometimes the best soldiers don't fit the mold, that courage and skill matter more than spit and polish, that focused, intense training for combat is more valuable than perfect uniforms. The Filthy 13 were not perfect men. They broke rules constantly. They got drunk, they fought, they disobeyed orders. But when it mattered, when lives hung in the balance, they performed. They jumped into darkness over Normandy. They blew bridges and destroyed German positions. They held the line at Bastogne in freezing temperatures against overwhelming odds. They did their job, and in the end, that's what mattered most. The story of the Filthy 13 reminds us that war is fought by human beings. Flawed, complex, sometimes contradictory human beings, not by perfect soldiers from recruiting posters. Jake McNeese and his men understood something fundamental about warfare, that when bullets are flying and bombs are falling, what matters is courage, skill, and brotherhood. Not the shine on your boots, not the crease in your uniform, but the willingness to stand with your brothers and complete the mission, no matter the cost. That legacy lives on today in every special operations unit that prioritizes mission over appearance, in every soldier who understands that true discipline comes from within, not from regulations, in every paratrooper who shaves a mohawk before a combat jump. The Filthy 13 showed us that sometimes the dirtiest soldiers make the finest warriors, and their story will never be forgotten.